I never went to family reunion. Well, they're really interesting now because we always have new members at every family reunion because of Ancestry.com, and glossophobia because I've had speaking anxiety, but I have been an author now for many years, and I have spoken, and one of the ways of getting over it is once I begin talking, I never stop. So I want to thank the Schuyler County Historical Society and the Montour Falls Library for sponsoring this event, and also Glenda Gephardt, the former director who began communicating with me about this event almost a year ago, and also to Heather O'Grady Evans for bringing it all together at the end, and Montour Falls Library and her mom. It's just been wonderful. So I have to stick to my notes because I'm that age. So I also want to thank my mother, Doris Force Houston, who passed on a year ago this month. She was always my first reader, along with my husband, and she so much wanted to hold this book in her hands before she died. She and some others in our family believe that we have Native American blood. Don't I look it? She was always enamored with Queen Catharine Montour, but how many of us have been throughout our lives who grew up here? We've all been enamored with her. While I cared for Mom when she was in hospice, I was able to read an edit of the book to her, and she was thrilled. I read it in increments, and one day, after reading to her, she grabbed my hand and she prayed, "Oh God, I love Cindy so much, and you love her, and I know that's a whole lot of love. Please don't let the wind blow away her dreams, and bring her a publisher." Well, less than 2 months after she died, I had an offer from a publisher for Catharine, Queen of the Tumbling Waters. So, thanks, Mom. And last but certainly not least, I want to acknowledge and give thanks to the Iroquois Confederacy, the Six Nations, also known as the Haudenosaunee, in particular the Seneca Nation, and of course to Queen Catharine Montour herself. I give thanks to the Great Spirit and to the sacred land that was once their land, and in many ways it still is their land because it's infused with their spirits. They acknowledge and still acknowledge the trees, the rocks, the waterfalls, the hills, and animals as brothers, sisters, cousins, grandfathers, grandmothers. And they gave thanks, and this thanksgiving resounds and remains in this gorgeous land. In my novel, at the end of the American Revolution, when Catharine and her people are at Fort Niagara during a horrific winter, and many of her people are dying, and in my novel, she's near death, she proclaims, "You will see us in all the rocks of the gorges in this land. We cannot be banished. We'll always be here and reveal ourselves through the land where our blood was shed, mixing in with the blood of those who conquered us. It is in the landscape where we will triumph. We were here before those who sought freedom to live with our faces in the rocks, our spirits in the waters, and the entwining love of the three sisters. Growing up, we had picnics and family reunions here at Havana Glen, and oftentimes I would come alone to Eagle Cliff Falls, and I would sit at the falls for hours. Now, there weren't that many tourists then, and sometimes magic happened. I would feel time stop, and I'd become one with the waterfalls, and the rocks, and the cliffs, and no, I was not smoking pot. It was as if there was another dimension to this waterfall, to this area. I wasn't afraid, but I knew when it was time to leave. There is so much to say. But first I'll tell you that I never intended to write about Queen Catharine. I was busy writing my Irish-themed novels, and besides, why would I, a white woman who knew very little about the Iroquois Confederacy, let alone Queen Catharine, take on such an endeavor? I left this area when I was young and eventually settled in New Hampshire with my husband and daughter. Over the years, I visit 2-3 times a year and walk the Catharine Valley Trail, which starts from Watkins Glen and I believe goes all the way to Elmira now. And sometimes I would stop at the Memorial Rock. Right here in Montour Falls, there's a Memorial Rock, And there's an inscription in Iroquois and in English that says, every one of you, always remember this. Every one of you, always remember this. Remember what? What did any of us really remember? We were taught in our schools, not really, about the Iroquois and Queen Catharine Montour. I grew up in cowboy and Indian movies, and that really does date me. And other than knowing that General John Sullivan led a campaign to destroy every Iroquois village at the end of the American Revolution, including Catharine's village right here, and that she led her people to safety at Fort Niagara, that's all I knew. So I've included a bibliography in my novel, hoping to encourage readers to learn more about the Iroquois Confederacy and about Queen Catharine, as well as to document all my research. I spent years delving into every book I could find, begin with looking at local historians' research in Schuyler County and the surrounding area. After preparing the novel for publication that includes a character index and bibliography, and I signed off on the contract with the publisher, I found another box of books that I forgot about that I had used. It's important to note that this novel is a work of imagination. It's inspired by the life of Queen Catharine Montour, who I believe was born in Pennsylvania around 1728, 1729. And yet this novel is full of real historical figures, real events, real facts. I found Catharine peeking out here and there in 3-volume history tomes, and gradually, although painstakingly slow, her life was pieced together. In the empty spaces, in this hide-and-seek research, I took creative license, and I used my imagination. However, I have to tell you that even then, Catharine was telling me what to write. Now, some of you may have read a blog post I wrote about my unusual, almost paranormal experiences about writing this novel. As I said, I never intended to write this novel. And one day while I was visiting here in New York, I stopped at the memorial, as I usually do, and I was again pondering the inscription. And I heard a loud voice in my head saying, "Write my story." I recall stamping my foot and saying, "No, I'm writing Nora's story." Nora is my 3rd book in the Irish Dresser series. Well, that evening, I took a book off the shelf about the Iroquois, and I was reading about the 3 sisters, corn, bean, and squash. In the morning, I woke up, and there was a big, dry kernel of corn in my bed. Now, it was May. It was not autumn when we hang corn husks on our wall. Nudge. That was the second nudge. The first was the voice in my head, which could be argued about. And they were big nudges. And all through these years, I've encountered dry kernels of corn in the most unusual places, usually when I felt like giving up. How could I write this novel? How could I piece the story together? Well, the last dry kernel of corn was during the pandemic on a remote deer path in New Hampshire, trying to keep away from people on the walking trails. A remote deer path, and I looked down a big old dry kernel of corn. There are no cornfields around. So I have them, and I have a little bag, you know, I'm a little woo-woo, and I have a little bag of, you know, crystal and special stones and you know, Indian nickel, and I keep my dry kernel of corn somewhere else. So I thought, I get here, and I go to bed, and I'm just looking at my stones and trying to get some peace, and in the morning, no, this just happened a couple of days ago, I wake up, I'm making the bed, there's 2 dry kernels of corn in the bed. They must have been in my little bag, I hope. So I tell you this because this is life if you pay attention for everyone. You know, not to write a book necessarily, but just living life and being open. So another time I visited, it was about a year after the first time I heard write my story. And I was walking the Catharine Valley Trail, and it was a beautiful May day. And I was humming, and suddenly I started singing in another language. Nobody laughed. But the day was so lovely, and my husband happened to call at the time, my engineer husband, and I told him jokingly I'm singing in the Iroquois language. And he, the engineer, said, "That's nice." And later that day, I went to the windmill market, and I am walking around browsing, and I suddenly heard music that eerily sounded like what I was singing. With my heart beating, I followed the music, and it was a Native American store run by a Seneca man. He gifted me with an owl necklace. That's my spirit animal. And he encouraged me to write this story. And the music you've been listening to is the music that I heard and the music that I bought, at the store. So on and on, because, I was giving up writing this novel again and again. So a number of times I was going to quit, as I said. And then at the Boston Irish Festival, I was selling books and speaking. I meet an author who wrote a book about General John Sullivan. And he and I were both surprised each other knew about Queen Catharine, all the way in Boston. And then another time, my husband and I were kayaking near Newmarket, New Hampshire. And we see a sign that said, General John Sullivan lived here. Now, we know the signs and know about what happened, but I had no idea he was in New Hampshire. He was a one-time governor and a statesman. So, a little over a year ago, the last encounter, I'm sitting in a restaurant in an old inn in Exeter, New Hampshire. And I feel very peculiar about this restaurant, something I need to know about this restaurant, the inn. So I do some research and find out General John Sullivan's son built it after the American Revolution. So in July, I'm having a book celebration there because it's poetic justice. So in regards to the Montour family and their notoriety and obscurity, Chad Anderson, the author of The Storied Landscape of Iroquois, and this is a wonderful book, and it's listed in my bibliography. He writes, settlers entangled their history with one of the most famous or infamous, but frustratingly elusive families of the early Pennsylvania and New York frontiers. Contemporaries and later historians have continually conflated various family members. Reportedly of French Indian heritage, Madame Isabelle Montour, this would be Catharine's grandmother from Quebec, crafted a complex persona, equally capable of engaging European and Indian audiences, which became the signature trait of the family. During the mid-18th century, her son Andrew gained considerable notoriety as a go-between. Andrew was Catharine's uncle, a man who employed his multifarious identity as a cross-cultural negotiator for colonists and Indians in colonial Pennsylvania. Colonists and historians have referred to French Margaret as Andrew's sister or cousin. She was likely the mother of French Catharine Montour. I believe she absolutely was, and she is in my novel. In local memories and histories, Catharine was often confused with her sister Esther Montour. And some of you may know that Esther Montour was known for the Wyoming Valley Massacre in 1778. And it's even said that Catharine could have been there herself. I don't believe she was, but there's a lot of material that is very, it's contradictory. So Anderson also writes, in their diaries, soldiers indicated that they had heard much about the Montour family. William Barton heard that Catharine raised and sold horses. Simultaneously famous and unknown, the Montours could appear and disappear as any plot demanded, rendering them a perfect family for a monument of uncertain origins and meaning. Joseph Brant, the Mohawk warrior, who was aligned with the British during the American Revolution, said this of Catharine. She was a handsome woman when young, genteel, and of polite address. In the Havana Journal of 1860, it is said that Catharine ruled with power and dignity. She was fearless and a determined character. She had more than ordinary intellectual powers. She meted out to all exact justice and demanded implicit obedience. She was regarded by the whites as a superior woman, end of quote. And so I grappled with all the incongruities, the tidbits of Catharine information, and I created a story of Catharine, whereby I believe she only ever wanted a simple life of love, of family, of nature, but when she was thrust into the complex times of the French and Indian War and the American Revolution, she became fierce as a warrior. But I believe also that she grew up in Pennsylvania, and I believe she was born 1728, 1729, and in a home with her notorious grandmother and her uncle. And they were go-betweens. They were cultural negotiators. They were diplomats. They were paid by the colonial government to translate and to do what they did. So although the family lived, and I'm assuming that Catharine lived with her family, I mean certainly when she was young, but all the way through I have her, and they moved a number of times. And they lived as Indians, but eventually they were considered wealthy in livestock, and again, they were paid. The uncle was paid, the grandmother was paid. So she grows up in this home with the notorious grandmother and her uncle, and this home is fascinating, filled with Europeans, missionaries, colonial government officials, and Indians of every tribe. And she was born during the time of the Long Peace in Pennsylvania, which was in the early 1700s, right up into the French and Indian War, where Europeans and Indians lived peacefully, relatively peacefully, next to one another, with one another. She had a colorful life. She married a Seneca chief. He died, she loves again, and in my novel, she loves yet again. Her family were always pro-British, but for a time, Catharine separates from them and aligns with the Delaware, the Shawnees, and other tribes whose land has been confiscated. She moves to Canisteo, New York. Canisteo is a sleepy, quaint little town in New York, and it has a fascinating history. Besides the ancient Indian Hopewell mounds, there was a village that was a village of renegades, basically. Soldiers who had defected from the British Army, French soldiers, escaped slaves, criminals. Catharine is found here, and she takes white captives. Because for a time, she's disgusted with the British and how they have been treating the people, the tribe she's grown up with, and her people. Her life entwines with these captives, natives, whites, allowing for a surprising amount of diversity and tolerance. And then she falls in love with a waterfall here, right here, Eagle Cliff Falls. And I have her traveling to Genesee to marry her Seneca chief, Telehina. She dreams of returning to this waterfall many times, and she isn't able to until later in her life to come here to Eagle Cliff Falls, this place, Catharine's town. She is like a centering pole on a carousel of desperate and greedy figures, becoming a peacemaker. She attends meetings in Philadelphia, and in my novel, she meets Benjamin Franklin. Now, it is recorded she went to Philadelphia with Iroquois chiefs before the American Revolution and after the American Revolution. She very well could have met Benjamin Franklin because he was fascinated with the Iroquois Confederacy and their constitution. And he wanted the same for the 13 disparate colonies. So I found no resource that says she met him, but in my novel she meets Benjamin Franklin. And when he excitedly states she and her people are also of this new country, she says, "I like the old country, Mr. Franklin, and have had no say in this new country." What Indian has? What woman has? What African has that you are in sympathy with? So now I'd like to read from the novel, a chapter in the book, an excerpt that describes Catharine's town just before Sullivan and his troops come into the village to destroy it. She's here with her people. She's the queen of this village, and her sons, Roland and John, are with Butler's Rangers, who the Butler's Rangers were a loyalist militia And Roland and John are captains. Her two sons are captains. I believe she was neutral, but her sons are part of the Loyalist movement. And they arrived here with a cadre of distinguished Iroquois chiefs and men, right here in little old Montour Falls, where we are now. Real history. So this is Catharine's voice. Soon enough, autumn is here, and there is more talk that George Washington is going to invade our Haudenosaunee country and destroy all settlements. I would like to believe it's another rumor, but feel this time we may be in danger. Andrew, Joseph Sweetgrass, and other chiefs say we must leave. I spend much time at Eagle Cliff Falls to comfort my fears and to ask the Great Spirit what we must do. The maple, hickory, and oak have especially revealed their splendor this year as I again watch the leaves float down the creek and away from their source. What will this autumn mean for me, for Catharine's town? I sell a few horses to Indians who come to visit and talk of this war. These Indians don't wish to fight and instead want to fight the Cherokee. When our prophet Daganowida founded our great confederacy, he cast the weapons of war into a pit and planted over this pit the tree of peace. Nations and allies were to sit beneath the shade of this tree on this turtle island of earth. The British and now the Americans are promising they wish to sit down under the same tree of peace with us. But can they sit together? There will always be war, it seems. I would like to declare my independence. Onondaga, the place of the Haudenosaunee Council Fire, was destroyed by the rebels. I have only heard this news now. They had declared neutrality, but who can be so when there is a stench of burning flesh and blood flowing into the earth? The council fire is temporarily being held in the Seneca village of Canadasaga, Chief Sayangarata, Old Smoke's home, Roland's father-in-law, on Seneca Lake. I'm surrounded by the fires of war, but try to maintain peace in our village and carry on with our life here. Roland sends a message asking if we can provide them with some of our corn again this season. Butler's Rangers are camped out there and are hungry. They are so close. We planted more corn this year, and my sister corn is as tall as our tallest Indian and is breaking open with sustenance that will feed us. It's nearly time to pick and harvest this corn, along with other vegetables and fruit, when Butler, his Rangers, and 600 Indians arrive here in Catharine's town, along with John and Roland. We're 14 miles from Sullivan's army and will harass this enemy as they approach, Roland says, his countenance hardly recognizable after months of being on the warpath, hungry, with his hands swollen and sore from killing and scalping. What a sight to behold in my town. I cannot help but feel proud of my sons among the Rangers, the Seneca army being led by Old Smoke and Black Snake leading the Delawares. The great corn planter is here. Farmer's Brother, Little Beard, Handsome Lake, and Red Jacket. They stay only 2 nights before leaving to fight General Sullivan's army, who is advancing toward us. Sullivan has a devouring army planning to destroy all villages and then going to Fort Niagara. It will be a new country, these rebels say. An America that will be a place of freedom and justice. My sons and most of my Indian brothers are now fighting against this new freedom, and so must I, but in my own way. Thank you. And now I'd like to introduce my beautiful cousin, Nancy Learn, who has written a song about Queen Catharine Montour. She and her band, Nothing Special, is going to play one song about Queen Catharine, and then after, I have a book signing, and we have plenty of food.